Well, thank you, Jeff, for that, and good evening, everybody. It's a delight to be here, and what a fantastic idea IEL is, and long may it continue. This morning, the tone of the day was set very firmly. As I sat with breakfast in the Victoria Hotel, the Beatles were playing, and they were playing All You Need Is Love. And that's the point. That's all any of us need. That's what linguists need in general, and that's what English linguists need especially. We need to be loved. We try to be lovable. And we need this more than other branches of linguistics, I suspect, because we are hated so much. We have spent the day, some of us, on normative linguistics, and we have been talking about the battalions of people out there who hate us simply because we try to say that things are as they are. So it can get to you at times, you know, and one needs to find groups of people who find you lovable. And the best way of finding these groups of people, it seems to me, is to go into applied linguistics. Because applied linguistics is the lovability of linguistics, as far as I am concerned. Applied English linguistics, therefore, it seems to me, is the best way of guaranteeing certain quantums of love for all of us here. Hence, although IEL in its conference is predominantly, it seems to me, on general English linguistics, sort of pure English linguistics, if you like, this evening I thought I would adopt a different perspective and talk about some of the applications that are ongoing in this area. It is a never-ending saga, it seems to me, applied linguistics and applied English linguistics. I always thought I knew what applied linguistics was. I remember being around when organizations like BAL were being formed and people were discussing the different kinds of categories that were going to be in the subject. And then as you went to applied linguistics conference after applied linguistics conference over the years, you got a bit blasé about it because every conference would have a section on stylistics and a section on English language teaching and a section on educational stuff, a section on speech pathology in later years, a section on forensic, a section on interpreting, a section on translating, and so on. And you know, you got used to it. It was a very familiar world. You knew where you were. And after a while, I thought, that's it. You know, applied linguistics has defined itself. We have a domain. It has its categories. They're recognized. They're even given Roman numerals in some organizations. And there we go. And until very recently, I honestly did think that applied linguistics had reached its limits. But not anymore. Because now I find all sorts of areas that I had not expected to exist, and certainly had never expected myself to feel the demand to contribute to. And I have three of them for you this evening. Each of them I'm currently working in some shape or form, but each of them requires huge numbers of people to work in if they are going to develop into a comparable level of the earlier domains of applied linguistics. I'm going to talk firstly about what I'm calling applied English historical linguistics, and then secondly, about applied English museological linguistics, whatever that is, and then thirdly, applied English internet linguistics. The handout that is sort of around is simply a handout of the references that I shall be making as I go through this talk. And if there are not enough, you can email me later and I'll send you a copy through the ether. So the first, applied English I had never expected to apply historical linguistics. Did you apply historical linguistics? My entire life, since being an undergraduate in those Jeff-long days, has been a love-hate affair with historical linguistics, and with sound changes in particular. It started when I studied Old English, as I guess most of you did, and you had a sneaking suspicion that this language might have been spoken once. And so you went to your tutor and asked him, Are we all right here? Yeah. Yeah, okay. I don't know what you did, but it was quite exciting. You would go to your tutor and ask him the question that I asked my tutor. Having encountered the Old English word for king, which was spelled C-Y-N-I-N-G, I went up to him and said, "How do you pronounce this?" And his reply was, "Well, we don't exactly know. It is, of course, a high front vowel, possibly rounded a little, and it derives from... Yes, but how does it sound? Can you pronounce it for me?" "No, I wouldn't like to do that, because that would suggest a value which we're uncertain about, because historical phonology is in an uncertain... Yes, but I just want to hear it just once." And he wouldn't do it, you see. He wouldn't do it. Eventually, I got out of him. It was something like Künning. I thought, oh, thank you, God, that's all I wanted to know. And whether that was exactly right or slightly not right didn't matter to me. The point was I had a word I could say. Beowulf now became something that plausibly you could read aloud and hear the effects of. And then somebody told me, of course, that that's how it was originally. But would you ever know by looking at the sound change studies that have been done on Beowulf and the rest? No, you would not. So as a result, I got very interested in sound changes as an end in themselves, but always from the point of view of how they would actually produce in practice, in performance, if you like. And I was glad to see, when I carried on my studies, that there were others around who shared the same view. A.C. Gimson, who taught me a great deal of phonetics, was very much of the same mind. And so but I never thought that this concept of turning historical phonology into practice, into performance practice, would ever become a serious reality. Until 2004. When Shakespeare's Globe approached me and asked me whether I would be interested in collaborating with them on an original pronunciation performance of Romeo and Juliet. Now, the reason why they were interested was because Shakespeare's Globe on the South Bank, as many of you will know, was set up 10 years ago, a little more, 1997, to introduce, as far as it is possible, original practices from Shakespeare's time. So the Globe itself is a reconstruction, as far as anybody can establish, of the shape of the theatre physically. Over the first 10 years, 8, 9 years, they introduced original practices in all sorts of domains. Original music on original instruments, original costumes, original movement around the stage, because as you may know, there are these two big pillars at the front and you can be hidden from the audience, so the actors are trained to move around the stage to make sure they're always in vision to some of the audience. Original everything, in other words, but not original pronunciation. And in 2004, they changed their mind. When I met the director, Tim Carroll, and said, "Why have you changed your mind?" he said, "Well, it's very simple. If we don't do it, Stratford will." And there is this great enmity, you see, this great envy between the Shakespeare's Globe on the South Bank and the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford-upon-Avon. So I said, "Why wasn't it done before?" And he said, "Because everybody was scared of it. Because there is a view about that if we produced plays in Shakespearean pronunciation, they would be unintelligible. Because the language has changed so much in the last 400 years," he went on. "And nobody wants unintelligibility at Shakespeare's Globe, because the theatre is only open for 6 months of the year. It is an open-air theatre. It had its last performance last weekend. It's closed now till next May. And they have to have bums on seats all the time. And the thought that you might put on a production which nobody would understand meant that they were scared of the audience just walking out." So I said to him, "Have you ever heard Shakespearean pronunciation?" And he said, "No, nor had anybody else. Could I give him some, please?" So immediately all those bits of brain that come from reading Dobson Once Upon a Time and Kerkeritz and all of those things, I suddenly had to put into some sort of practical application. Moving fast forward ahead, having done the relevant revision, as I suppose you might call it, or research, to top up those batteries, I was able to give him something which, of course, was not unintelligible at all. The version that I used with the Globe, and still use with them because they've done other productions since, goes something like this. Instead of the the opening of, let's say, the opening of Henry V, the chorus speech, which, of course, ought to be, "Oh, for a muse afar that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention, a kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene. Then should the warlike Harry, like himself, assume the port of Mars, and at his heels, leashed in like hounds, would famine, sword, and fire crouch for employment." Thank you, Sir John. Now, that is how it's normally done. But of course, in Shakespeare's time, it would have been something like this. "Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention, a kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene. Then should the warlike Harry, like himself, assume the port of Mars, and at his heels, leashed in like hounds, would famine, sword, and fire crouch for employment." Now, whatever the ins and outs of that, oh my, you're sounding like a Globe audience now. Well, the point is that the audience did applaud that production of Romeo and Juliet in extremely warm and effusive terms, and also the next year when we did Troilus and Cressida there in OP. And the reason was because, of course, they understood it, as you did. Even if we could debate, as indeed there are already historical phonologists around this room saying to themselves, now, Crystal's front vowel there was probably not quite, I don't think it would have been so much sin, but perhaps sen, or maybe it might be sin. Yes, let's debate this. And I noticed he dropped his H's all the time. Now, is this actually the case? Did H dropping, was he? And you know, there are people now thinking along these lines. Fine, that's exactly the point. Yes, these are issues which I'll talk about in just a moment. The question of post-vocalic R, the question of the ion ending, as in invention, the question of the schwa start to diphthongs, you know, words like loins for loins and loins for lines, that sort of coming together. Closer front vowels, dropping of H, all of these things need to be debated and are debated in the literature. But the point is, when you're on the Globe stage, you can't go to the front of the stage and say, two O souls, but actually it might be households, both alike in dignity, but it might be dignity, in fair Verona, but it might be fair Verona. You know, people will start walking out then. So, the basic point, it seems to me, is that although there are a number of issues here to do with how these exact values should be interpreted, you have to, in an applied historical, phonological, dramaturgical linguistics, you have to opt for something, and that's the sort of value I opted for. The point was that the opting that I did was not of my own devising only. The decision was made jointly by the director and the company and me. My job was to present to the director the range of options that were available in Shakespeare's time. So take the ION ending. We know from the various studies that have been done of this period that that was a period when that ending was changing in pronunciation. In the early period, around about 1580, 1590, it was probably musician for musician, musician. But a little later, from the reports that we read, it was probably musician. And then not long after Shakespeare's death, it would have become musician. So these are debatable issues, but there is a trend, and you can see the changes taking place over the period. Which of these three, the first two pronunciations, I said to the director, do you want to use? You have the choice between musician and musician. And he had to think about it, and he said, I want the older one. I said, why? He says, well, if we're putting on a performance of original pronunciation, people will come expecting it to sound old. And therefore, the older you can make it, in other words, the more different from modern English you can make it, the better, as far as he was concerned. Now, who am I? You know, I'm just a linguist here. Who am I to say, no, you mustn't do that? This is a decision. It's a sort of prescriptivism of a kind, if you like. But it was his decision rather than mine. Now, there were lots of issues of that kind. Issues of speed, for example. Hamlet says, speak the speech trippingly upon the tongue. What does trippingly mean? Don't mouth it as the town criers do. Well, obviously, my dear, we are talking about every consonant being articulated, as indeed is the way in which modern actors are often trained at organizations like RADA. But that is something that Hamlet is very much against. And indeed, all the apostrophes that you see, and they were around in the first folio all over the place, illustrate that there was lots of speeding up taking place. And therefore there is a contrast to be made between Romeo looking up at the balcony and saying, "It is my lady, oh, it is my love, oh, that she knew she were," on the one hand, and the OP version, which would have been more something more like, "It is my lady, oh, it is my love, oh, that she knew she were." And there is a difference of 2 seconds between the first version and the second. And when they did Romeo, and produced it was being done in parallel, you see. There was a modern English version going on throughout the season, and then the original pronunciation took up a weekend. So both versions were going on at the same time. The poor actors, you can imagine, they had to hold 2 versions of the play in their head at the same time, and they were timed. The production in OP was actually 10 minutes shorter than the production in modern English. So that's how all those apostrophes add up, you see. They add up to about 10 minutes worth of time when it comes to performance. How do I know? What was the reasoning behind my deductions about this? Where did I get my information from? The usual methods that any of us in historical phonology would use for deducing the form of an earlier pronunciation system. One looks at the puns and the rhymes that no longer work in modern English and make your deduction. If something doesn't work, then there are only 2 explanations. Either the language has changed or Shakespeare was a lousy poet. And on the whole, one goes for the first hypothesis. In this way, you can produce really quite fresh readings of the plays that were not available before. Not just rhymes that work in a more convincing way, but puns that emerge, that people simply are not mentioned in any of the notes on any of the plays. For example, in Troilus and Cressida, the character of Ajax, who lumps about the place, a thick soldier, really, and is often mocked by the others. And at one point, Thersites says of him, "Well, for whomsoever he be, he is Ajax." And that's an insult. But if you think about it, what's insulting about that? That's just saying, whosoever David Crystal is, he's David Crystal. And that's an insult? No, it doesn't work. But in original pronunciation, in Shakespeare's time, Ajax was pronounced Ajax, and Jakes was the Elizabethan word for a piss house. So basically what he's saying is, for whomsoever he be, he is a Jakes. He's calling him a shithouse, basically. And that makes a good joke, which is no longer possible in modern English. So you look at the puns and the rhymes. Secondly, of course, you look at the spellings. This is an excellent source of data from that period. We all know about spelling standardizing and so on and so forth. And it does mean that you can look at the spellings and deduce an awful lot about the pronunciation from the way in which these words were spelled. For example, in Romeo and Juliet, in the Queen Mab speech, where he talks about this little fairy going through all the brains of all the people and giving them dreams. And he talks about her having a chariot pulled by a grasshopper with a whip of film. A whip of film, a lash of film. Now, film is spelt in the first folio and also in the quarto, Philome. So it must have been pronounced with 2 syllables. One deduces. It must have been philom or something like that, but steadfastly philum, which is not an unusual pronunciation, because you hear it, for example, in modern Irish. You know, are you going to the film tonight? No. Yeah, sure, I'm going to the film as well. You know, film is a perfectly plausible pronunciation. And thirdly, of course, you use the sources of the time from the contemporary orthoepists who were writing in spelling reform from 1550 and onwards, weren't they, for 100 years? And you look at what they have to say. And they are brilliant in saying, this is how I pronounce this word. This word rhymes with this word. This word does not rhyme with that word. It's fantastic. How do I know that post-vocalic R is pronounced at that time? Because they say so. Quite plainly, we pronounce the R after vowels. Thank you very much. That's exactly what I wanted to know. Ben Jonson, for instance, goes through every letter of the English alphabet and tells us how they are pronounced. He even gives us a gloss every now and again. He says R, he says, is a littera canina, a doggy sound. Think grrr. Or maybe grrr, but probably the retroflex rather than the other. So you put these three types of evidence together and you get the version that I came out with. Not suggesting for one moment that it is the only way in which you can put all the evidence together, because the evidence is sometimes contradictory. And the evidence is sometimes incomplete, especially for proper names, which aren't often referred to in the orthoepist's work. And so you're guessing a bit there how exactly to pronounce Caesar, for example, at the time, and words like that. So this leads to a number of, well, research initiatives that when I was doing this, I looked for help from and couldn't find any. This is the thing. I mean, I didn't want to do this. I want to find it from somebody else and save myself a bunch of time and so on. But I couldn't find very much on OP, on Shakespeare pronunciation as such, apart from, of course, the classic works like Dobson and Kerkeritz and so on. And a number of issues came up as I worked in this area, and I just mention 4 of them now. First of all, the question of which variety to use. The older version, the more modern version, in terms of 1580, 1590, 1600, 1610, and so on. We know that these variations exist because actually Shakespeare tells us. In Romeo and Juliet, Mercutio describes Tybalt as one of these new tuners of accent. What could he possibly have meant? Well, Tybalt obviously speaks with some of the new pronunciations that were coming in at the time, and actually some of the new grammatical constructions that were coming in at the time as well, like the use of very as an intensifier. And the musician example illustrates the changes that are going on. We need, I think, a stylistic or sociolinguistic dimension to this kind of work, which largely is lacking, it seems to me. Secondly, if you take a particular hypothesis, how is it conveyed in original pronunciation? Take class distinction. There's no RP. So how do you convey class on stage? If everybody sounds as if they come from the farm down the road, then how do you distinguish somebody who doesn't? How do you distinguish the Capulet seniors from the Capulet juniors, or the nobles from, in Henry V or Henry IV, from Falstaff et al.? How do you do it? This was a big issue for the actors. They were very worried. You know, they relied so much on RP to sound posh, you see. And if RP is not available to them, they didn't know what to do. The director had a very clear direction for them. He said, if you want to act an upper-class person, this is how you do it, he says. You act. And what he meant was, act. You know, look noble, look superior, hold yourself in the right way, walk in the right way, and so on and so forth. Oh, yeah, I hadn't thought of that, said the actors, you know, yeah, of course. Also, the point about conveying class and associated sociolinguistic matters, it isn't, when I talk about an original pronunciation, I'm talking about an early modern English sound system of that particular period. And of course, I'm talking about a phonological system here. I'm not talking about a phonetic system particularly. In other words, one allows for the fact that any of these sound contrasts that I illustrated earlier could be realized with a variety of phonetic realizations. And we know who was on the stage in Shakespeare's time. We know where they came from, these actors that were in the company. We know one came from Norfolk, and another came from Warwickshire, and another came from Lancashire, and so on. And therefore, they will have brought to the stage their own local accents. And so we kept that in the Globe productions. There was one guy from, the lady who played Juliet was from Scotland. So she had a Scots kind of OP. Another guy was from Northern Ireland. He had a Northern Ireland kind of OP. They all said musician, but they said it in different ways. And so this kind of variation needs to be explored. The interaction between phonetics and phonology in a context like that. Thirdly, the attitudes to the accent, language attitude studies here, really interesting. I know nothing on this, and all I've got is anecdotes to report. I would go round in the interval to everybody and ask them how they were finding the play. And they all said they, first of all, understood it, and they were enjoying it and having a great time. And then they all said, without exception, whoever I asked, of course, we speak like that back where we live. So, people from the West Country would say, oh, we speak like that where we come from, yes. And then people from Ireland were saying, sure, we speak like that in Ireland as well. And I met this guy from Virginia who said, we speak like that in Virginia. And so we're getting, everybody was owning the accent. There were a group of teenage inner city kids in the corner, and I go over to them and I say, how are you finding this, lads? And they say, it's great, innit? And I say, what's great about it? And they say, well, because it's all original, innit? And I say, how do you know that? Our teacher told us, innit? And he said, so I say, what's impressed you so much about it? And this one kid turned to me and he says, well, normally, he says, you go to theatre and it's all posh, innit? But it's not here. Yeah, they don't talk posh here. They talk like us. Now, there's nothing in my version of OP, was there, that sounds like that kind of Cockney. They weren't talking like us, but the kid thought they were. So there was obviously an accent here that is reaching out to the kids in a way that other accents do not. And I think this deserves a great deal of study to see how certain accents elicit a kind of resonance with your own accent background. Some work has been done on this in modern English, but I don't know of anything that's been done in early modern English. And lastly, the fourth area, how on earth do you teach the actors all of this? They've got to be taught it. I did it by a combination of transcription and exemplum. I recorded the whole play in OP and left them the tape recording to take home so that they could hear my version and sort of interpret it in terms of the way they wanted the thing to go ahead. A dangerous maneuver because, you know, they might just copy you. But in fact, these are good professional actors and they didn't. They adapted the thing in all sorts of ways. But what sort of transcription do you use? You know, if you give them a full phonetic transcription, they're not going to be able to follow it. You've got to. And what I ended up with, and I got some examples of this in my book, Pronouncing Shakespeare, was a sort of intermediate stage where every sound that was the same as in modern English, I left in modern English spelling, and every sound that was different from modern English, I gave a phonetic symbol to. So it's a kind of midway house. I hadn't come across anybody else working in this area before, except one, and that was John Barton, who was a famous Shakespeare director from way back to the 1950s, who actually did a performance of Julius Caesar in his version of original pronunciation in 1952 in Cambridge. When I learned that, I had to meet him, so I went to meet him and we had a good natter. And the first thing we did was we gave each other our versions of OP to see whether they were similar or not. They were identical, more or less. Why was this? I began to reflect. And I asked him, who taught you? And then it all became clear, because he went to see Daniel Jones. I went, in my training, to see A.C. Gimson. Who was Gimson's teacher? Daniel Jones. So, obviously, the two versions are going to come together in a sort of study of historical attitudes towards phonetic transcription and so on and so forth. Another neglected domain in our business. This was an area that was completely new to me, how to apply that kind of knowledge set to a dramaturgical situation, and all kinds of fascinating research possibilities open up. My second area I'm calling Applied English Museological Linguistics. Today in our workshop, and I suspect in many other workshops too, the question has been raised, how on earth do we interest people in our subject? If the question is for linguistics in general as much as English linguistics in particular. Linguistics has long had to address this question, and of course there are many ways in which linguists have tried to make progress in this area. Some have succeeded and some have failed. The failures outnumber the successes, it seems to me. Certainly in the area of, now what do we call it? Museums, exhibitions, spaces, galleries. There is no obvious word for how you put across our subject in a museological context. The word museum, at least in English, this is not true for all languages, does have connotations of deadness and past and archaism and so on. And we're very anxious that the modern language should be part of any exhibition, which is very much alive. And in any case, when OP becomes alive, It's no longer dead. So even history can live, as it were, in that sense. Most linguistic suggestions along these lines have been failures, by which I mean the suggestions that began in the late 80s and early 90s to have a linguistics museum, if you like, to put it like that, or a language museum, or a languages museum. A number of departments around the world have small-scale enterprises of this sort. But the question is, where are the major public enterprises of this sort? You can go to any city in the world if you're interested in natural history and go to the Natural History Museum. If you're interested in science, you can go to the Science Museum. If you're interested in dolls, for heaven's sake, I mean the little toys, you can go to a, steady on now, you can go to a doll museum, and so on and so forth. But if you're interested in language and languages, which museum can you go to that is publicly present and welcomes you in and shows you what we're all about? In the mid-1990s, a group of us in London tried to initiate a venture of this kind. It was called the World of Language. It was a proposal that was put together in association with the British Council. It was developed to a business plan stage. It was going to cost quite a small sum of money, really, 25 million pounds, that is. We didn't put it in any bank at the time, fortunately. But we didn't have the money, of course. And the British Council came behind it, and we even identified a building on the South Bank, next to Shakespeare's Globe, as a matter of fact, where this would be. And all it needed was government investment of that amount, of that size. And it was just about to go ahead when the government had a better idea. They called it the Millennium Dome. And as soon as that idea went ahead, all investment stopped in other projects of that cultural, educational kind. So that idea never went ahead. And I know of several other ideas for language museums of one kind or another which have never gone ahead for the same reason. Today, things are a bit better. There is a museum of language just opened in the United States this year, in fact. And there's a Casa de las Lenguas, the House of Languages, opening in Barcelona, probably next year or maybe the year after. And there are a few dialect museums and things like that scattered about the place. In Britain, still nothing. But English linguistics also needs to be looked after in this way. It's one thing going to a museum to look at languages in general and find out all about multilingualism in the world and all those things. But for us, where is the museum, or whatever we call it, of the English language? Again, there's nothing very much around, is there, other than the indirect material in places like the British Library. There, of course, you can go in and you can see your Canterbury Tales and your First Folio and the Johnson and all of this, and you can admire them. But the caption and the associated literature tells you nothing about the linguistic significance of these great works. You get stuff on the literary significance and the social significance and all the obvious things, but nothing much on texts. So therefore, it's of great interest to me, and I hope to you, because this news is not public yet, but it is now, that the British Library is now planning its first ever exhibition on the English language, probably for the later part of 2010. It's going to be a 6-month exhibition, and for the first time, they're going to devote the entire half of their ground floor, where they have those exhibitions, to some sort of array of stuff which represents our field, both in writing and in speaking. This is not the first time that a London museum has tried to do something. The London Museum itself, the one that's over at London Wall, has a medieval gallery which was innovated about 3 or 4 years ago, and they did bring a small linguistic element into that. So it is now possible to go into that gallery and press a button and hear Beowulf spoken aloud and Canterbury Tales spoken aloud and the Paston Letters spoken aloud in something approximating to the pronunciations that would have been around at the time. But that was very, very small. Likewise, the BBC, from time to time, has tried to do this, and I give a reference in the handout. There is a BBC site which produces a linguistic timeline, and there again you can go in and have a listen to Old English and Early Middle English and Late Middle English and so on and so forth. But nothing on the scale of the British Library proposal. Similarly, they are proposing a website which will correspond with the exhibition, but which will last, of course, a lot longer than the exhibition, which will put onto the web all the materials that will have been collected for the exhibition as such, aimed specifically at A-level students and undergraduates, that sort of level, but obviously of potential interest to everybody. Of particular interest to the British Library is the focus on ephemera. They are as fed up as I guess the rest of us are with thinking of the history of the English language purely in terms of the Canterbury Tales and the First Folio and Beowulf and so on and so forth. What about the rest? And of course the British Library has got an unequalled collection of ephemera, from cooking recipes to letters, as we heard earlier in the day in one of the workshops, and many other things beside. They want that, the ephemeral stuff to be just as prominent here as anything else. The other big project, which is at an early stage of planning, is called, at the moment, simply the English Project. This is a project that's going to start in Winchester, probably in 2012. A group of people there have identified a building in the middle of the town, one of those huge old barn-like places which is available, and they've started the business of planning for an exhibition, a permanent exhibition this time. The British Library one is a temporary exhibition. This is a permanent one, which they hope will have several floors and cover what it needs to cover. I'll comment on that in just a moment. 2012, if the money can be made available. Once again, remember the Millennium Dome scenario. Now we have the Olympic Games scenario. It is now extremely difficult to get money out of the government if you can't make it anything to do with the long jump. And so they have a problem here. But they're doing their best, and they're doing their best by publicizing the populist interest in the English language, which is without a doubt out there. A book that came out this month is called Kitchen Table Lingo, and it's mentioned in the references. And this is a collection, the first one as far as I know, of the words that any family uses that are local to their family, familect words, if you like, which nobody outside knows at all, but which have become part of family tradition, often over decades. And so long as people can show that the usage has been over decades, then they sent it into the English Project and they've produced a book of these things. And some of the words are the weirdest words you'd ever imagine, but of course they remind you of words that you yourself have used in your own family settings. What are the applied issues here? Well, I've got four, once again. First of all, the one I've mentioned twice now. What goes into such a gallery, into such a museum? How do we best represent the history and present state of English? I mean, if we all sat down now and wrote out the things we would expect to see in a museum of this kind, would we have all written the same lists? I don't know. I suspect not. But somehow we really need to establish the sort of balance that needs to be in an exhibition of this kind and have certain principles which will guide our judgment here. For a typical principle would be, presumably, the balance between standard and non-standard varieties of English, for instance. But think now about the distinction between local and global and all the other issues that pull us in different directions. The other dimensions, like language acquisition from young to old, social, what principles do we need to structure the exhibition? I know of nothing to guide the British Library in this respect. It needs a lot of thought. Secondly, how does one show the material to best advantage? How can one be interactive with people who are coming round an exhibition of the English language? The Globe has already done something along these lines. Shakespeare's Globe has an exhibition which is open all year round, and that's highly interactive. You can go into front of a machine and you can trade insults with Shakespeare. You can you have a little list, and you press a button, and out comes an insult. Bawling, blasphemous, incharitable dog, and you can say, you whoreson thief, and you can have a great insult exchange there. Very great fun, very great fun. You can edit your own text. You can be given all the variants for the to be or not to be speech that turn up in all the various forms, and you can put together your own version. You can be a Shakespeare editor for an hour, and you can print it out and take it away, and this is your edition of Shakespeare. Now, there are lots of fun things, and to see the kids queuing up to do this is really makes your heart glow. How can one be interactive in this way? This is, I suppose, applied English museological pragmatics. Thirdly, the text linguistic issue. How do we write or speak explanations about what we do for a public that is going to stand in front of you for a maximum of 1 minute? You see, from museum studies, we know that the average time of people standing in front of an element in an exhibition before they move on to something else is somewhere between half a minute and a minute. It's that sort of time. Rarely do people stand longer than a minute. You really got to be grabbed to stay longer than that. Often it's half a minute or less. So what are you going to do? How are you going to write your caption? What sort of caption will it be? How does one do it? What is the graphology of it? There are all sorts of questions here. Again, I know nothing about reading and research in what we might call applied English museological stylistics. And fourthly, the terminological issue. What on earth do you call such exhibitions? Do we call them museums or galleries or spaces or houses or what? I don't know the answer to that either. I wasn't expecting to be involved in that sort of world either. 5 years ago, it hadn't dawned on me that there could be such a subject as museological and so on. But it's part of the job, and I've been approached, and I guess some of you have too, and you have to put your thoughts on and look for research, and you don't find it, so you've got to start thinking. This is a big area, and I would hope that people somehow will start contributing to it. We've got a few years, after all, a couple of years, before the first big exhibitions go ahead. The planning is being done now, but anybody who feels they would like to spend time on this area would find that their thinking is immensely valued. And then thirdly and lastly, the applied English internet linguistics. The internet is one of our biggest challenges, I think, as linguists generally and as English linguists in particular. The challenge is there because, well, first and foremost, the difficulty of getting the data. I'm not talking about the web, that's easy to get hold of. No, I'm talking about the range of internet functions where it's simply damn difficult to get the data. You can't just go into a chat room and download the stuff. They don't like it. They don't want you to be there. They don't like linguists lurking around in chat rooms. They want you out of there, and they tell you so. So how do you get chat room data? How do you get blog data? What sort of permission range do you need to have? Whose copyright is it anyway? And all of that sort of thing. When I was doing my book on text messaging recently, I had terrible trouble getting examples of texts from everybody. I would go up to somebody and I would say, can I have your texts? And they would say, no. They're mine, you can't have them. It's a cheek asking, I would ask my kids and they would say, yeah, but give me a minute, Dad. And then you'd get a sort of sanitized set of texts coming through. Lucy living in Amsterdam and drugs aren't mentioned even once, come on, yeah. So, difficulty of getting reliable data and uncertainties about the permission is a big problem for many areas of the internet, which is a shame because here we're dealing with the largest historical corpus ever. Remember that everything on the internet is time-stamped. Maybe not on the surface, on the screen, but in the data behind the screen, you will find a time reference. So now we can do extraordinary studies, not just this word seems to have arrived in English somewhere between 1660 and 1820. No. We can now say this word is used for the first time in English on the 11th of November 2004 at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Now that gives us an entirely different perspective on historical language studies, it seems to me. Now you might think, well, this is fine. It will take a while before anybody will really ask us questions of that kind. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm getting them all the time. And several urgent areas are being inquired about. People are looking to linguistics for help here. And because English is still the dominant language of a lot of internet activity, they're looking for answers to English linguistic questions. For example, there are broadly speaking, five areas that I've encountered which give this kind of, which demand linguistic input. Firstly, automatic document classification. If you're holding a huge range of electronic documents, you want to be able to classify them into thematic types. Lawyers, for example, spend hundreds of hours trawling through their stuff, looking for relevant information about the case that they're currently dealing with at the moment. They would give whatever it is they give to have that sort of thing done electronically. But it requires, of course, a fairly sophisticated linguistic analysis of the content of the documents to enable that to be done. Secondly, search relevance. The problem is still today as it was 10 years ago. You can type a word into Google and hope you'll get relevant hits, and the relevance results are somewhere between 40 and 50% for the most part. Say you're interested in economic depression, you type depression into Google, you will get millions of hits, but the first 20 pages will all be about Prozac and telling you how to avoid your mind going wrong, because it's the psychiatric sense of depression, which is the dominant sense on the internet. One really would like to have a filter which is linguistically sophisticated, which is lexicographically based, which would say, which sense of depression, sir or madam, do you require? Do you require the psychiatric sense, the economic sense, the climatological sense, or the geological sense? You click on the relevant one, and a filter operates, and you go through only to the relevant pages. That does not exist. And the reason why it doesn't exist is because the linguistic basis for such a filter, which involves primarily lexicon work, but also grammar to some extent, and spelling too, hasn't been done. Thirdly, e-commerce. There are many retail sites out there now, and we try to search them looking for something we want to buy, and often we fail because the linguistics is pathetic. For instance, once I wanted to see whether this site had mobile phones, so I typed in mobile phones. It said, we have no mobile phones. I then typed in thinking, I know, I'm a linguist, I understand. I will type in mobile-phones. No, we have no mobile-phones. Okay, mobile-phone. No, we have none. Mobile space phone. We have none. I know, it's American. Cell phone. We have none. Cell-phone. We have none. Cell-phones. We have none. Customers would have given up at that point. Linguists are made of sterner stuff. I kept going and eventually find that the only term that the software would recognize was cellular phones. That's all. Well, you know, that's so stupid of the software. I mean, obviously that needs a sophisticated linguistic input where all the variables, spelling-wise, punctuation-wise, dialect-wise, and so on, are included in the system. It isn't often done. Fourthly, internet security. This is, I suppose, linking up with forensic linguistics generally, trying to identify problems of fraud, terrorism, aberrant sexual activity, and so on the web, or in chat rooms, children's chat rooms in particular. A few years ago, I was asked the question, can you spot a paedophile in a chat room? And the answer, I thought, after a little while, was yes, I think I can. But in order to establish that, you have to do an awful lot of analysis of real paedophile conversations. Now, this is not easy, because as soon as you try and download paedophile, you see the problem. You see the problem. You've got to be careful here. You have to check in with the police first, who look at you very suspiciously. They say, why do you want to do this? And you say, I'm an applied linguist. And they say, oh yeah, a cunning linguist, I suppose. And they make jokes like this, and you get very embarrassed, and so on and so forth. Eventually, you can get coverage. You've got to go to the Home Office before you can get, in Britain at any rate, before you can get permission to even do this kind of research. And even then, it's dangerous. I know a guy who was doing a PhD on paedophile activity up in the north, in central Lancashire. and he was investigated by the police several times. It had all been okayed with the university, so it was all right. But when the thesis was finished and they had to send it to the external examiner, the university was told by the police that if they sent it through the post, they would be breaking the law. Because this is sending perverse material through the post, and this is not allowed. So the guy had to take the flipping thesis by hand to the external examiner in order to get it done. So people are naturally very sensitive about this. It's extremely difficult research to do, but it needs to be done, because it can be done. Pedophiles are stupid. They use very simple, they think sophisticated, strategies for trying to elicit interest from a young girl or boy. And, you know, what are you wearing? I mean, for heaven's sake. And so it doesn't take much of a linguistic intellect to work out what the strategies of interaction are. But it does take a linguistic intellect, and that's the point. Very little work of that kind has been done. And fifthly, and lastly here, advertising. The biggest driver of the internet, without a doubt, advertising. And the problem here is how you make your advertisements relevant to the page. A few years ago, there was a story of a street stabbing in Chicago, CNN story. The ads down the side said, "Buy your knives here." "Get your knives on eBay. We have excellent quality knives. We can stab better than anybody else." You can see how that happens. The stupid software, based on some simple statistical algorithm, has looked for the most frequently occurring words in the website, found knife and knives a few times, gone to the advertising inventory that is held in the database, found knife along with fork and spoon, and assumed that that is the relevant word to. How do you solve that problem? You solve it very easily. You solve it by doing a semantic analysis of the whole content of the page. You don't rely on individual words. You look at all the words on the page. Deduce that there are other words like murder and crime and so on. And then you deduce it's about homicide, and then you put the ads down the side to do with crime prevention and safety and so on. But you see the point. Once again, you've got to do the analysis of the semantic content of the page. And this is not just a matter of identifying lexicon, it's a matter of identifying grammatical constructions and so on. The point to remember here is that most web pages are multi-thematic. It's very rare indeed to find a web page that just has a single theme. So just because the web page at the top is all about tennis, shall we say, to take an example I had just the other day, and you think that page is about tennis because the headline says, you know, Federer, whoever it was, has just won this competition, and you read the first paragraph and it's all about Federer winning, you say, oh, the page is about tennis then. But if you read down, you find that it's also about cars, because the reporter eventually talks about the tennis star's taste in motor cars and what car he came into the tennis tournament. It was a BMW, and he talks about BMWs and so on. And then at the bottom, it's all about sex, because he talks about who the tennis star came to the tournament with. And there was this blonde in the back of the car, so that now leads the reporter to talk for a couple of paragraphs about the guy's sexual tendencies. So here we have a three-theme page, which isn't obvious from the headline and the first paragraph. You've got to take this into account, and only a complete semantic analysis of the whole thing will do this. So here we're bringing together a whole range of English linguistic domains: semantics, stylistics, discourse, text, pragmatics, lexicography, computational linguistics, natural language processing, and so on and so forth. It doesn't stop here. There are three domains that I've found myself involved with over the last 5 years only, and new angles are coming up all the time. The domains of childhood, Dylan Thomas once said, have no order and no end. The domains of applied English linguistics have no order and no end either. IEL, it seems to me, is a perfect place to provide some order, but not, I suspect, any end. Thank you very much.